I'd actually like to start by going back a little further in history than 50 years. Over the time, I've had the opportunity to study tribal societies in Somalia, Vanuatu, and Iraq in hopes of ways of finding a way to respect their culture while giving them an opportunity to engage with modern society. You are following the tradition that is nearly as old as human civilization when you talk about startup cities. Sounds like the beginning talk, doesn't it? Early nomadic societies developed codes of law to provide nonviolent solutions to problems developing between traditional clans and new clans. The creation of a new clan becomes essential as clans of more than a few thousand people were unmanageable. Generally, clans consisted of 3 or 4 generations, at which point they would have to split into new clans. Clans were generally based, the legal codes they developed were based on equity rather than retribution, which is what our criminal codes now have. An eye for an eye is an example of equity, not retribution. Criminal justice, in the end, the biggest sanction was expulsion. And I was sort of interested in seeing that in Prospero, and they'd ask the question is, someone who doesn't obey the rules of Prospero gets expelled. And so in tribal societies, that was considered a just and fair punishment. And we're still talking about using that today. The nomadic societies eventually settled down. And in Amphipolis in 357 BC, when Macedonia conquered them, they were declared a free city, which gave them the right to make their own laws, print coin, elect their own magistrates, and they remained a free city even after the Roman conquest in 168 BC. In fact, they operated as a free city for 3 or 4 centuries, until their harbor silted over, which had nothing to do with their governance. In 31 BC, Butarant, which is a wonderful place to visit in Albania, Augustus Caesar named it a civitas libera, a free city, as a place for his veterans to retire that had helped him win the Roman Civil War. It was just after the Battle of Antietam where he defeated Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Again, the city was free of the imperial taxes, immunity from customs, inheritance, sales, and tribute to the central government. They understood then that central governments could retard growth and economic prosperity. The city prospered. They were also given the self-governance to raise their own taxes, make and adjudicate their own laws, elect their own leaders and judges for the primary purpose of economic development. That sounds like a lot of the things that Prospero has, and we're talking 2,000 years ago. Incidentally, I hope Prospero does better than the original founding of Amphipolis, because the original 10,000 inhabitants were massacred by local tribes and eventually had to be replaced. For those of you who love competing governments, this is a map of the governments of Europe in the 14th century. There are about 350, I got tired of counting, but at least 350 individual governments. Even places called peasant republics, free lands, communes, along with more traditional things like bishoprics, kingdoms, principalities, lordships, republics, electorates, duchies, etc. It was a time of rampant warfare for almost 100 years until the Treaty of Westphalia put an end to it by the creation of the nation state. I think this history is important because entrepreneurs trying to start new societies need to remember they are never starting tabula rasa with a blank slate. First, what we're trying to do has probably been done before. Secondly, they're already starting in an area that's covered by existing law. Territorial sovereigns pass these laws for a reason, and there's usually a class of people that are benefited from them, which is why we tend to do it in a limited area rather than doing it for the whole country as a whole. The World Bank is fond of saying that free zones and zones of various types are not the first best policy because it would be best to do it for the whole country. What they fail to realize is politically that's never possible. Even on the high seas, which are outside the territory of any sovereigns, the sovereigns have gotten together and created the law of the sea, which says all vessels must fly the flag of a nation. Article 92. Or a UN agency, 93. Or it is subject to boarding by any nation's navy. Article 110. If they fly the flag of a nation, they are subject to the rules and laws of that nation. So it's awfully hard to get away from some type of territorial sovereign nation control unless you can strike independence and get some nation to do what Malaysia did to Singapore and throw them out of the country so that they could form their own country. So make an effort to understand what's already been written on the slate. Then change only what you need to. For example, here in Honduras, the original law developed by Paul Romer for charter cities went into detail on forming a charter city police force, enumerating what its powers would be. But he did not need to. Under the Constitution of Honduras, every municipality has the right to form a local police force. But they don't because they don't have the right to tax. But all you need to do, we needed to do in the Zeta law was to declare the Zeta a municipality or to have municipal authority. And indeed, in the third article, it says, Zetas shall have the functions, powers, and duties that the Constitution and laws confer upon the municipalities. They can form a police force. There's no need to write paragraphs dealing with scary police powers. And indeed, by phrasing it that way, you are seen as supporting local government, local laws, the local constitution, rather than writing multiple paragraphs that try to annul local law. Therefore, it's seen as more constitutional. Second, most of what you want to do has already been done before somewhere. It often helps with local leaders if they are comfortable with what you're trying to do. You may be all fired up by your ideological vision of what proper governance is. They're probably not. They don't like to be seen as guinea pigs in your experiment in governance. You may be motivated by feelings of aggressive, innovative, forward-thinking types of government. But most government officials don't share your enthusiasm for novelty. Tone it down when you're dealing with local government. And third, make the effort to talk to some of the more powerful opposition leaders. As you know, governments change. Ideally, one can get broad political backing for one's project. In Russia, I was able to spend some time with the opposition leader in about 1995. And the opposition leader of the national legislature, and I got him to agree not to oppose us. Now that doesn't sound like much, but what it meant is he could block the law from going to vote, but he didn't. He voted against it, his party voted against it, but the law passed. And all it took was spending about an hour with him, drinking a hell of a lot of very good vodka, and drinking it faster than he did. And we made Russian policy. So, spending time with a very unpleasant man was worth getting his neutrality. Unfortunately, here in Honduras in 2012, my client, which was one of the party in power, didn't want me to do that. And as I will discuss later, there is a compelling reason for SEZs in Honduras. And I'm not sure the current administration has ever heard them. Now, I did have an opportunity to talk with one of the potential opposition leaders, the Archbishop, because he was on the same plane that I was on. And one of the things you have to find out is that policy is made idiosyncratically. And I ordered the beef dinner. And when they got to him, they only had the shrimp. And he says, I'm allergic to shrimp. And so I say to the stewardess, he can have my beef dinner. I don't care. I'll take the shrimp. And he blessed me, and we had a nice conversation. And he basically agreed that the Zeta was not a bad deal for Honduras. He had been, or people felt, that the Catholic Church would be opposed to it. Now, the next slide comes to more recent times. The picture on the left I took when I was in Dubai in 1977. I told you I'd been around for a while. The picture on the right I took when Dubai in about 2018. You can see the rounded coastline and a hell of a lot of development. Their first free zone didn't even start till 1985. There's been obvious success, but what caused the growth? Well, this is another one of these pictures. I took this picture standing on the beach in 1977. This little thing here is the first high-rise in Dubai. It's the World Trade Center. It's one of the first buildings on Sheikh Rashid Road. I was standing probably right about here at the time I took that picture. Dubai was used as an example earlier today and is often used as an example of the successful use of free cities in creating economic development and wealth. And they're seen as being a genius for it. It is a truly remarkable story. However, the story is significantly different from how it is often told. The first free zone in Dubai was created to cover a huge mistake, not the result of insightful planning. Sultan bin Sulayman was standing in the sand by their new port with me. And he says, Sheikh Mohammed thinks we ought to have a free zone here. But we have no taxes. We have no customs. We have no currency exchange. What's the purpose of a free zone? And one question I always ask is, are you getting the types of investment you want? Because actually, free trade zones, which was a common term that was used, is pretty silly because they're not free, they're not about trade, and they're often distributed throughout the country in individual factories, so they're not zones. And the free zone is there to attract investment. And he says, well, you can't invest unless you have a 50% Arab partner. And out of that conversation was born the Free Zone Corporation, which was the first 100% owned foreign corporation in the Gulf. International companies could come in, put in a parts warehouse, and sell into the country to a 50% partner, into Saudi Arabia with a 50% partner. They weren't at 0.25% when they got to Saudi Arabia because it was two 50%. They could bring in training centers, duty-free imports, bring people in because the free zones could issue visas. And in fact, I interestingly at one point was doing work in Israel. I did a negotiation between Yasser Arafat and Netanyahu, and I had an Israeli stamp in my passport, which presumably kept you out of the UAE. But I entered the free zone, and the head of the free zone let me in. They had that authority. So, the right to establish became another incentive that the early zones started to offer. And by the way, 85 is about 10 years after Kaohsiung and some of the early zones in Asia. Many years later, Sheikh Mohammed noted that one thing Arabs had was money, but there was no international money center in the Middle East, and asked, how come? And we noted that international banks and insurance companies could not really operate under Islamic commercial law. Therefore, Sheikh Mohammed designated 110 hectares of land to operate under English commercial law. This was the exercise of a true sovereign. It didn't diminish his sovereignty. The sovereign, under one definition, is he who makes the laws. And there's nothing that says he can't make different laws for different parts of his country. A true sovereign is comfortable with using the full powers of sovereignty. He can have two customs services. He can have two judicial systems, two banking systems. He can have 6 of them if he wants. Only the sovereign can do that, but he can do that. Dubai is now one of the top 10 international money centers in the world, and the only one in the Middle East, Africa, or South Asia. It's probably known to all of you as the basis of using the laws of other countries within startup cities. What you may not know is that shortly after Singapore became independent, they used the English legal system with appeal to the Privy Council as your final appeal. So Dubai wasn't first, except it applied to all of Singapore, not just to 110 hectares. And even today, there are 34 countries and territories in which you have the right of appeal to the British Privy Council as the Supreme Court of the land. And 11 of those are actually countries. What you're doing here by having a choice of legal systems is not unique. Incidentally, in Walloon in Belgium, you can choose either, I think it's French or Dutch law when you form a company. And this is a part of France that basically speaks Dutch. And you were in France, but you can have your company founded under Dutch law. So, yes, it's sort of special and unique feeling. But if you're trying to sell it to government, you ought to let them know that it's been done before and it works. It makes them more comfortable. And if you're trying something new, that's how you get it passed. And that's how we got the Zeta law passed. Incidentally, among those countries that use British law are Bermuda, Cayman Islands, Jersey, the Isle of Man, all offshore banking centers because of that legal system. Incidentally, I said that it was a mistake that Jebel Ali, the port there, what happened is Sheikh Rashid, who was running Dubai at the time, was the ruler at the time, borrowed $4 billion from his cousins in Kuwait, dug a hole in the desert. There was no natural port there. There wasn't a creek. There was no reason to have a port there, except when the United Arab Emirates was formed in about 1973, I think. Abu Dhabi said they would build a new capital city on the border between Abu Dhabi and Dubai. And Dubai said, we're going to stay the trading power and we'll build the port for that city. And after they put $4 billion by digging a hole in the sand, Abu Dhabi said, we're not building the city. And they were sitting there wondering, how do we get our money out of this? And Sultan bin Sulayam, whose father had worked for the Sheikh for a long time, was given the task of being port director, customs director, and director of whatever else he started there. And he was told it was his only chance of working for the government. And it did work out well enough for him that for a little while he had a bigger boat than Sheikh Mohammed. Shortly after 1979, and slightly before this, this is the Dubai International Financial Center, which I just talked about. In 79 to 84, the Chinese started their special economic zones. We're told that the special economic zones were a great success. In fact, they failed. In 1984, I got a phone call that said, everybody said what we were doing is great. You wrote a paper that said it was terrible. And in fact, I was living in Hong Kong at the time. I've got some photographs of people using sampans to smuggle refrigerators into China, where Shenzhen is now. And they created the zone as a laboratory to observe foreign business practices. Foreign businessmen don't like to become guinea pigs. And so that wasn't attractive to them. The Chinese military provided conscripted labor to your factory. They brought the labor in at, I think it was 75 cents a day is what their pay was. It may have been 75 cents a week. And then they charged you 2/3 of the going rate for labor in Hong Kong and kept the difference for their own purposes. You had very little control over your labor. Management authority remained ambiguous, and there was a great deal of management corruption within the zones. So foreign investment, after an initial flurry of Hong Kong companies, dried up, and all the investment that was going into the zones was from interior Chinese states, provinces, that wanted to get in on the corruption. So in 1984, I got this call, and I said, what do we do? And when I put the investment in China, we didn't go into the zone. We went somewhere else. We found a co-venture partner, and we negotiated a private investment decree that gave us management rights, gave us ownership of the equipment, at the time, even in the zones, there was no corporate law, there was no labor law, there was no real estate law. Why was there no reason for a corporate law? Every economic entity was a division of government. And the problem was that you don't pay the police department in the South money when you take a police car and assign it to the North. They could take your assembly line out of radio factory number 7 and put it in radio factory number 5. Because once it crossed the border, it wasn't your equipment anymore. It took a private investment decree to give us the rights to do management and own the equipment. And incidentally, about 3/4 of the foreign investment law that came out in '85 ended up being based on our private investment decree. They did, like any other things, create their own legislation, reduce taxation, and eliminate customs duty, but they did it quite haphazardly and changed it often, so there was no predictability. And I insist that one of the first things that you need in a zone is to have predictability. Doesn't matter if you could have productivity, you can't have profitability if it's not predictable. In fact, you can't really have successful productivity. China thought they had covered the bases. In any case, we changed the philosophy to that the zone's focus was to become a world-class business environment. What China failed to understand was that there were no cookie-cutter zones. They couldn't just take the UN model zone law, put it in China, and be successful, because they had different problems. Here in Honduras, I helped draft the '87 law of industrial zones and export processing. Actually, we did the work in 1986, but it's considered the best economic development program in Honduras history. It's created over 150,000 direct jobs and 500,000 indirect jobs, or about 15% of the labor force is employed in the maquila industry. It accounts for 38% of the country's exports. However, unlike the countries in Asia like Singapore and Taiwan, Honduras didn't amend and grow the free zone law. They stuck with the same law for 30 years. And once they got a certain level of growth, they weren't going to get any more in garments. They still do t-shirts. They started in t-shirts and they still do t-shirts. Everyone else even moved from t-shirts to the high end of garments is structured female fashion wear, suits. They didn't do that. They didn't get into electronics. I will be done in a minute. So we presented to Honduras in 2012 this graph, which uses the Index of Economic Freedom from the Heritage Institute. Hong Kong is shown as number 1 in the world at the time as the red line at top. The blue line is Honduras. What the zone needs to solve for is to close that red gap. And that red gap is property rights, freedom from corruption, labor freedom. And by labor freedom, what they mean is Honduran labor laws were outdated, cumbersome, bureaucratic. They added a lot of cost, but not a lot of benefits to workers, which is why in the Zeta law, which is why in the Zeta law, the Zetas have the ability to write labor code. If labor code had been up at 70 or 80, that wouldn't have been as important. But when it's down at 30, You've got to close that gap or you're not attractive. By the way, anything under 50 is considered repressed. 50 to 60 is mostly unfree. 70 is moderately free. 70 to 80 is mostly free, and 90 is free. So we didn't have to worry about the fiscal freedoms or government spending. We worried a little bit about business freedoms and the other thing. But every country you go into, you need to do something like this to say, this is why you need to deal with the legal system. Because otherwise countries don't like you to interfere with their domestic policies that much. Be part of the host country. Now, this is two meanings. One is the international organizations keep trying to tell you that free zones of all types are extraterritorial. They're not. If they were truly extraterritorial, the country has no right to create them. But if they are a territory of the country subject to a different customs chapter, the territory of the country subject to a different legal chapter, then you will begin to have access to certificates of origins, which you want because that's how you take advantage of multilateral trade deals. If you're extraterritorial, you don't get the certificates of origin. You should also have duty charged only on imported materials that are imported into the zone and not on the value in the zone. Now, that's consistent with the idea that it's part of the territory. And under the Zeta law, Chapter 1 says the Zeta is an inalienable part of the customs territory. And in our draft, we had this provision. But unfortunately, the legislature changed it, and imports from the Zeta to the local economy is treated as a foreign import at its value. If you can get this provision, then you have competitive advantage over every country that doesn't offer that. And it's consistent with the law. If the value added in the zone is added in the territory of Honduras, it shouldn't be dutiable. And if a company has a choice about locating in a country in which part of its sales to the local market is going to be only partially dutiable, and all of its sales in another market is going to be dutiable, they're more likely to locate in the one that has the lower duty, so that it's not treated as a foreign article. And therefore, the country that offers this incentive has a competitive advantage. And finally, be humble. Let locals, by and large, get the credit. You're not being elected. Let them be seen as leading the charge. Involve local investors when possible. They tend to be the wealthy, which means they tend to be part of the elite. And as part of the elite, they have some of the political strength to help protect your status. And communicate, 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 communicate. Yes, talk to opposition leaders. Talk to everybody you can. Thank you.